colonization after colony. The historians who is working on the chronology, when you consider post-colony as a reality, it means that he neglects or he has a negative way on the independence. The word I think should be used is post-independence. I know, no, it's not you, but they are politicians, because they don't want to accept that the colonization ended. They prefer to use post-colony, new colony. No, I say that we historians, we African historians, should not accept to use that term. Because it's in our conscience to say that, don't forget that you still colonize. Okay.
I think they are ready. Yes.
Because they're working on recolonization by putting that there is not yet the end of colonization. That's why when you say discussion of terms, I like it. Okay. The one who wants colonization to continue is no matter to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, when he opened the first panel, Piet Campoy said it was an honor to be chairing the first working session. For me, it is an honor, and I think it's also a challenge, to open and to chair the last working session. The usual rules apply. I won't repeat them. We have 3 contributors, and I'm going to introduce them one after the other. The first will be Professor Joseph Vincent Ntuda Mbode from Cameroon, sitting to my left. And he is both a sociologist and a political scientist. He studied in Lyon and has a doctorat in sciences politiques de l'Université Jean Moulin Lyon 3, obtenu en 2006. He now works with the Université de Yaoundé. Il est le directeur du Centre de recherche d'études politiques et stratégiques à l'Université de Yaoundé. And he is also the directeur de l'Institut de gouvernance des sciences humaines et sociales de l'Université panafricaine. He was. Il est devenu directeur plein de cet institut. Okay. In any case, he is a leading international expert on tout ce qui concerne les enjeux de paix, de sécurité et de la défense en Afrique et dans le monde, both academically and in the media. So we are honored to have you here, and we are looking forward to what you are going to be saying to us. Thank you, and you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président de la séance, de me donner la parole. Mon exposé de ce matin porte sur le thème que vous avez sur l'écran, la guerre d'indépendance au Cameroun, front, théâtre, bataille et tactique. Et je voudrais, en prenant la parole ici, en réalité, faire le compte rendu de la communication qui a été envoyée. Vous aurez constaté, mesdames, messieurs, en vos titres, grades et qualités, que hier, mon compatriote professeur Abois nous a présenté les raisons du deuxième échec armé de la quête de l'indépendance du Cameroun par le parti nationaliste connu sous le nom de l'Union des populations du Cameroun. Notre propos de ce matin se situe dans le sillage de ce qui vous a été dit hier. Il s'agit principalement d'une investigation sur les fronts, les batailles et les tactiques de cette guerre, dont une lecture transversale amène à observer, en partant d'un point de vue de la polémologie, qu'il s'est agi d'une guerre sans front, première idée, au théâtre d'opérations hybrides, deuxième idée, reposant sur deux types de batailles, troisième idée, aux tactiques multiples, quatrième idée. Donc, contrairement à la communication qui est structurée en deux parties, ici, dans ce compte rendu verbal, je vais donc vous présenter les findings, comme on dirait en anglais, en structurant sur les 4 points qui sont aussi les 4 éléments fondateurs de notre communication. Alors, comme je l'ai dit tout à l'heure, la première chose qu'on observe lorsque on s'intéresse à la guerre d'indépendance au Cameroun, conventionnellement ainsi appelée, c'est que c'est une guerre sans front. Alors, pourquoi une guerre sans front? Tout simplement, ça a été déjà dit par plusieurs exposés depuis hier, alors que les guerres conventionnelles interétatiques ont des fronts fixes. Les guerres asymétriques, qui couvrent l'essentiel des guerres d'indépendance, d'ici et d'ailleurs, ont difficilement ce qu'on va appeler un front lorsqu'on parle du point de vue de la science. Ce sont donc des guerres sans front, mais cela ne signifie pas que ce sont des guerres sans zone d'affrontement. Lorsqu'on regarde dans la guerre camerounaise dont il est question ici, on va se rendre compte qu'il y a eu principalement 5 grandes zones d'affrontement. Une grande zone qu'on va appeler la zone du centre, où résidait le principal leader charismatique, connu sous le nom de Nyobe, et une seconde zone qu'on va appeler ici la zone ouest, où un certain nombre de leaders également se sont repliés. Une troisième zone qu'on va appeler la zone littorale, autour de la ville de Douala et de ses environs, et une quatrième zone un peu plus indirecte, le Cameroun étant un pays, comme vous le savez, qui a été confié à la Société des Nations pour l'administration et par la suite à la Grande-Bretagne et à la France pour accompagner à l'indépendance, le pays s'est donc retrouvé composé de 2 communautés anglophones et francophones. La quatrième zone dont il est question ici, c'est donc celle qui traversait l'espace francophone où la guerre réellement avait lieu pour aller se réfugier dans l'espace anglophone. Donc, c'est une zone, on va dire, intermédiaire et indirecte. Et cinquième zone, enfin, c'est ce que j'ai appelé la zone sud transfrontalière, parce que là, elle traversait la frontière en direction du pays voisin Congo-Brazzaville, et d'où un certain nombre de combattants prenaient ou se réfugiaient et à partir de là entraient sur le territoire camerounais. Donc voilà les zones dans lesquelles le conflit s'est organisé en termes de front, mais front entendu comme zone d'affrontement. Deuxième élément majeur, les théâtres hybrides. Je l'ai dit tout à l'heure, dans une zone conventionnelle, il y a effectivement des théâtres, mais ce sont essentiellement des théâtres militaires conventionnels. Ici, dans la guerre du Cameroun, il y a deux théâtres hybrides. Un théâtre non militarisé et un théâtre militarisé, les deux allant dans le même sens. Le théâtre non militarisé et politique pose et porte la question majeure autour de laquelle s'affrontent la France coloniale et les indépendantistes. Les indépendantistes revendiquant à la fois l'union ou l'unité des deux parties anglophones et francophones du pays d'un côté, revendiquant également l'indépendance du Cameroun de l'autre côté et refusant enfin de faire partie de l'Union française. Voilà le pôle d'achoppement politique qui constitue donc ici le premier théâtre et non militarisé. Le deuxième théâtre, donc, lui, militarisé, mais aussi clandestin, est donc constitué autour des trois zones que je viens d'indiquer tout à l'heure, les zones d'affrontement militaire. Lorsqu'on part maintenant sur le troisième élément fondamental, les batailles, on observe deux types de batailles en apparence contradictoires. Le premier type, c'est ce que je viens d'indiquer tout à l'heure, au début et surtout aux Nations Unies, là où les indépendantistes portent leurs réclamations, il est question de revendiquer auprès des Nations Unies, de la France également, l'indépendance, d'un côté, la réunification de l'autre, mais aussi le refus d'appartenir à l'Union française. Cela va se passer de manière constante pendant que le leader Oumniobé est encore vivant. Mais une fois décédé ou tué, et les élections ou alors les accords devant conduire à l'indépendance acceptée par la France et la communauté internationale, l'UPC, qui revendiquait l'unification et l'indépendance, commence à refuser l'indépendance. Pourquoi? Parce qu'elle estime que ce sera une indépendance fictive. Donc, en apparence, la bataille, au début, assez claire, devient un peu diffuse à la fin, parce qu'on ne connaît plus, on n'arrive plus à très bien cerner si le parti revendique l'indépendance ou si le parti refuse l'indépendance. Mais le motif principal, comme je viens de le dire, c'est que cette fois-là, l'UPC pense que cette indépendance, si elle est donnée dans ces conditions, sera fictive. Et dernier élément, les tactiques. Comment tout cela se joue sur le terrain. La recension des éléments que vous pouvez retrouver dans l'article ou la communication indiquée donne à penser qu'il y aura plusieurs tactiques, mais avec deux majeures. Deux majeures, la première qui est essentiellement portée par la puissance coloniale française, c'est d'abord des guet-apens sous forme de provocation. Et au terme de la provocation, il y a réaction. Et après la réaction, il y a répression. Voilà comment la France va agir essentiellement. Et deuxième grande tactique sur la place de ce conflit, c'est après la mort de Oumniobé, le conflit s'étant généralisé, ce qui me permet d'ailleurs de faire une relation avec ce que j'ai entendu de l'autre jour sur Haïti. La mort de Oumniobé semblait, pour la puissance française, mettre fin au conflit, mais elle a plutôt radicalisé le conflit. La deuxième tactique française devient donc de prendre le contrôle de la population au sens où, dans toute guerre asymétrique, on va dire que la population est l'élément majeur à prendre ou alors à ne pas prendre et donc à perdre la guerre. La population est devenue le centre de gravité de cette guerre d'indépendance. Donc, sur la base de ces trois éléments, qu'est-ce qu'on observe? On observe, premièrement, que la guerre d'indépendance au Cameroun, comme la plupart des guerres d'indépendance, est une guerre asymétrique. Parce que c'est une guerre asymétrique, d'un point de vue de la science, il est difficilement acceptable de parler de front. On va donc parler des zones d'affrontement. Mais ne pas parler de front ne signifie pas ne pas avoir de théâtre de confrontation, qui se résume donc ici comme étant l'élément appelé aussi zone de confrontation. D'un autre côté, on observe également que parce que c'est une guerre d'affrontement, des disputes de souveraineté, elle alterne à la fois la dimension politique et elle alterne également avec la dimension militaire. Pour chuter en disant qu'on a donc l'impression que ce soit une guerre asymétrique ou une guerre conventionnelle, la guerre reste toujours la poursuite des objectifs politiques, pas d'autres moyens. Et je crois que c'est sur ce point que je chute en vous remerciant pour votre aimable attention.
Monsieur le professeur, je vous remercie. Je vous remercie aussi pour tenir autant. That brings us to the next contribution. The next contribution will be by Professor Georg Frerks from Utrecht University, and there from the Department of History, Art History and International Relations. That is a wide scope, and that, of course, intrigues me and makes me wonder what exactly you're going to say to us about the dream of an independent Elam. Professor Frerks, please.
Mr. Chair, thank you. I also like to thank the ICMH and the Hellenic Commission for providing me the opportunity to present my paper entitled The Dream of an Independent Elam, the Insurgency of the LTTE in Sri Lanka. Grievances about the way Tamils were treated by the Sri Lankan government led to a desire among sections of the Tamil population to establish an independent homeland called Elam in the north and the east of the country. And in the late 1970s, this ambition took the shape of a violent separatist struggle against the state, spearheaded by the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Elam, short LTTE, that was to last nearly 3 decades before they were defeated by the government of Sri Lanka in 2009. My communication discusses the evolution of the separatist struggle and hopes to answer the question why the LTTE could persist that long. Let me explain, for a proper understanding, that Sri Lanka is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious and multilingual country. The majority of the population are the Sinhalese, who largely are Buddhist and speak the Sinhalese language, while there are Tamil and Muslim minorities who speak Tamil. The Tamils are mostly Hindu. Due to the political and electoral system in Sri Lanka, the Sinhalese Buddhists control parliament and hence can carry through legislation as they wish, also against the interests of the minorities. And in fact, this happened frequently after independence, and this became an important contributing factor to the conflict. First of all, immediately after independence in 1948, the Sri Lankan government disenfranchised 1 million Indian Tamil workers who had been brought from South India in the 19th and early 20th century as plantation laborers by the British, and who were now rendered stateless. This created serious anxiety among other minority groups, including the Tamils of the north, who lived already in Sri Lanka over 2,000 years. Second, in 1956, the newly elected Sri Lanka Freedom Party government declared Sinhalese the sole official language, Sinhala only, to the detriment of Tamil and English, thereby effectively excluding Tamils from government jobs. In response, the Tamil Federal Party demanded a federal state comprising a separate Tamil-speaking northern and eastern part and a southern Sinhalese part, and also demanded that both Sinhala and Tamil be recognized as official languages. And it further demanded a stop to state-aided colonization of Tamil areas by Sinhalese farmers, which was a third bone of contention. Fourth, Sinhalese mobs attacked non-violent demonstrations and protests by the Federal Party, the Tamil Federal Party, against the new policies, and anti-Tamil violence spread across the country. Tamil shops were attacked and looted, and an estimated 150 Tamils were killed. And finally, the 1972 Constitution awarded special protection to Buddhism, and an earlier clause protecting the ethnic and religious minorities was removed. And in the meantime, there were regular episodes of violence against Tamils, often with the connivance or complicity of the state and police, and impunity of the offenders. So all this created grievances. The Federal Party, the Tamil Party, proved unable to achieve any meaningful results in its negotiations with the government. And in the 70s, the various Tamil parties joined together and formed the so-called Tamil United Liberation Front that want to establish a free, sovereign state of Tamil Elam based on the right of self-determination in order to safeguard the very existence of the Tamil nation. You see here how they adopted the UN language. And from that moment on, the Tamil politics took an ultimately violent turn. Since the late 1960s, young Tamils had organized themselves in militant political groups. Already in 1969, the Tamil Elam Liberation Organization was set up with the 15-year-old Velupillai Prabhakaran, the later LTTE leader, as a member. Under the leadership of Prabhakaran, the Jaffna mayor, Alfred Duriyappa, was killed, who was seen by the militants as a collaborator of the government. And this marked the first political assassination of their opponents by the militants. In 1976, Prabhakaran robbed a bank and walked away with $500,000 of rupees. It was an enormous amount of money at that time. And 2 months later, on the 5th of May, he founded the LTTE, which started training new recruits and started to engage in significant armed skirmishes with the Sri Lankan army, and also killed Sri Lankan policemen. It acquired arms and received military training from India, and the LTTE ultimately succeeded in eliminating all competing militant groups and claimed to be what they call the sole representative of the Tamil-speaking people in Sri Lanka. After the ambushing of 13 soldiers by the LTTE in 1983, and you may remember this, widespread anti-Tamil riots broke out in Colombo, killing hundreds, if not thousands, of Tamils and damaging the homes and livelihoods of possibly 30,000. 100,000 Tamils were displaced and 175,000 fled abroad. There is evidence of the Sri Lankan government's complicity in organizing those riots. And soon hereafter, the conflict escalated into a full-blown war that was to last for 26 years. The LTTE waged in total what they call themselves 4 major Elam wars against the government, and negotiations between the parties failed. Only in 2002, a ceasefire agreement was brokered by the Norwegian government, and the boundaries between the areas controlled by the government and the LTTE were delineated and supervised by the Sri Lanka monitoring mission. In its area of control, the LTTE ran its own de facto state. However, after a few years, numerous violations of the ceasefire agreement occurred on both sides, and in 2008, the government formally abrogated the ceasefire agreement with the aim of vanquishing the LTTE militarily. After a swift, massive, and bloody military campaign, it finally defeated the LTTE on the 19th of May 2009 and extinguished its entire military and political leadership, including leader Prabhakaran. Now, despite its ultimate failure to gain a separate state, the question remains why and how the LTTE was able to persist so long and achieve several military successes during its existence. And in the remaining part of my communication, I'd like to discuss 4 crucial factors in this regard. Number 1, the grievances among the Tamil population against the Sinhalese government and the resulting legitimacy of the LTTE. Second, the military audacity and ruthlessness of the LTTE and their initial aura of invincibility. 3, their de facto sovereignty, governance, and control of territory. And 4, a narrative of sacrifice, heroism, and liberation. First, the grievances and the legitimacy. As discussed earlier, subsequent Sinhalese-controlled governments passed laws and programs that were deemed discriminatory and exclusionary by the minorities in Sri Lanka. Promises to revoke the controversial laws and measures were broken several times by the government, leading to a growing frustration. And even though the LTTE used terrorist means to achieve their goals, this accumulation of grievances and frustration about the lack of any progress provided legitimacy to their armed struggle among significant sections of the Tamil population. Recent research I did in Tamil areas shows that these grievances continue unabated at present, and that many Tamils still admire the LTTE and its leader Prabhakaran, even to the extent that some refuse to admit that he has died. Since the 1980s, the LTTE and its propaganda machinery among the Tamil diaspora abroad skillfully broadcasted a message of suppression and discrimination by the Tamils by the Sri Lankan state, and adopted a narrative about their right of self-determination and the necessity and legitimacy of their political and military struggle. This reverberated in Western media and also gained some support among Western parliamentarians, especially when confronted with the plight of Tamil refugees and asylum seekers after Black July in 1983. This initial sympathy with the LTTE only turned into a more critical stance after Al-Qaeda attacks on the Twin Towers and the killing of Rajiv Gandhi by a LTTE suicide commando. Some countries listed the movement as a terrorist organization, limiting their possibilities for international exposure and fundraising, but this happened quite late and not by all Western countries. Let me move to my second point, military audacity. The use of unconventional tactics and bravura the young Prabhakaran already showed in the 1970s continued to characterize the LTTE's warfare. They used a large variety of both conventional and terrorist means, including hit-and-run attacks on Sri Lankan army camps and terrorist bombings in the heart of Colombo, such as of the central bank and bus stations. It was one of the first movements in the world to use suicide commandos, and they assassinated several Sri Lankan and Tamil politicians, including a president, the ministers of defense and foreign affairs, as well as high-ranking military officers. In 2001, 14 Black Tiger, that were the suicide commandos, carried out a spectacular attack on the heavily protected Katunayake Air Base and the airport, blowing up 26 airplanes and causing a damage over $350 million, creating a heavy impact on the Sri Lankan military and airline industry. The LTTE also became notorious for its forced recruitment. The one-person per family rule forced every family to contribute at least one cadre to the LTTE fighting force, including child soldiers. And another remarkable feature was the cyanide capsule that cadres had to swallow when they fell in enemy hands to prevent them from preventing sensitive information. The LTTE also had a large amount of women in combat. They made up to 30% of the Tiger fighting force. All these factors create an image of a formidable, well-trained and well-equipped, disciplined fighting force that was difficult to engage and for a long time deemed invincible. The top-down nature of the organization, an image of total control, and the secrecy and myth surrounding its leadership added to this picture. It also has to be remembered that initially the Sri Lankan army after independence was little more than a parade ground army that only slowly developed into a more professional and full-grown force over the years. The image of the LTTE invincibility was further strengthened by the failure of a 100,000 soldiers Indian peacekeeping force that was unable to control or defeat the Tigers. In 1987, Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi and the Sri Lankan President Jayawardena concluded the controversial Indo-Lanka Accord that led to the deployment of this IPKF Indian peacekeeping force. However, the LTTE was not party to this accord, and as soon as the Indian forces started killing and controlling LTTE cadres and tried to disarm them, they came to be seen as enemies. The IPKF was ultimately unable to formulate an effective response to the LTTE forms of guerrilla and asymmetric warfare, and they ended in failure, leaving large caches of weapons and ammunition behind that fell in the hands of the LTTE. And as you all may know, a female suicide bomber, Danu, killed Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi in 1981 at an election rally in South India. Then I come to my third factor, de facto sovereignty. The LTTE had always aspired to attain sovereignty in the areas it's considered to be the Tamil homeland, Elam. Yes. They achieved this at least partially during several episodes and exercising territorial control of the Jaffna Peninsula and in the Vani, an extensive area in the northeast of Sri Lanka. Next to their armed forces, they built initially their own police force and judiciary, focusing on rule and order and assuring compliance of their subjects. The LTE had not only the coercive ability to discipline the population, but it also attempted to legitimize its rule by what it deemed to be a righteous order, which included, for example, decent and disciplined behavior among those who were being ruled, but is also extended to their own cadres and staff who were strictly supervised. Apart from law and order, the LTTE also exercised sovereignty through the provision of social services and to provide various functions usually identified with modern statehood. They had, for example, health, educational and agricultural services, banks, a so-called peace secretariat, and also a unit looking after martyrs' families and war veterans. It goes without saying that de facto sovereignty, territorial control, and a functioning governance system are huge assets for a rebel group fighting for a separate independence. It allowed the LTTE a safe base from where to launch attacks, to recruit fighters, and to raise taxes, and to project their imagined state of Elam by mimicking statehood. My final factor is the narrative of sacrifice, heroism, and liberation. The LTTE adopted a symbolic repertoire to entice its population and gain legitimacy. As I said earlier, the narrative of liberation of the Tamil motherland resonated well among much of the Tamil community. And they also had a lot of symbols, a symbolic repertoire. For example, there were phrases, there were songs, there were pictures, there were logos, stamps. They had a national bird, a national tree, and a national anthem. I think Kairos' story about Cyprus, reflected similar symbolic elements. And another issue that gained legitimacy to the LTTE was the preparedness of the cadres to fight and die for the cause. As Roberts explains, a well-known Sri Lankan expert, martyrdom was a critical factor in drawing popular support among the Sri Lankan people. And the LTTE organized yearly commemorations of the fallen cadres who were attributed the status of heroes. I come now to my concluding remarks, Mr. Chair. It is obviously not simple to answer the question why and how an insurgent movement like the LTTE could persist that long and be rather successful before it was finally defeated. There are obviously many factors involved: historical, contemporary, domestic, international, military, sociological, and economic. And in my paper, I have addressed 4 factors that were internal and crucial to the LTE struggle and its perceived legitimacy, but conspired to make them a formidable opponent. I made a point that he managed to portray a valid cause and serious grievances vis-à-vis the Sri Lankan state, and that their narrative of self-determination and liberation reverberated both domestically and internationally, also in the international arena. The second factor was their military audacity and the availability of a well-trained and disciplined fighting force that was not only prepared to use terrorist tactics, but also to fight and die for the cause. The possession of de facto sovereignty and territorial control was a big asset for the LTTE, as a launching pad for attacks, a base for recruitment and taxation, and to gain popular support by a variety of means, both coercive and voluntary. Despite those factors, the tide turned against the LTTE in the early years of the new millennium. One issue was the loss of international sympathy for the insurgents in the wake of the Twin Tower attacks. The LTTE had also fallen out with its erstwhile patrons in India, while it also had to face a defection from one of its major commanders, Karuna, to the Sri Lankan government, who took part in the LTTE fighting, who took part of the LTTE fighting forces with him and divulged sensitive intelligence. Further, it can be paradoxically be surmised that the very mimicry of statehood that the LTTE aspired and its subsequent sedentarization in the Vani during the ceasefire agreement engendered a greater vulnerability from the Sri Lankan forces that had in the meantime grown into a professional force in numbers larger than that of the UK. Ultimately, the Sri Lankan army managed fairly swiftly, but also with the use of considerable violence against both their enemy and the civilian population, to walk over the LTTE, something it would have found more difficult if the LTTE had still only been a versatile, asymmetric jungle force as in early years. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Professor Freggs. And we're still doing fine for time. Ladies and gentlemen, introducing Erwin Schmiedl to an ICMH audience is a bit like what the ancients would call taking ols to Athens. You may have heard about him before. He is the director of the Institute for Strategy and Security Policy of the National Defense Academy in Vienna. He is, of course, the president of the Austrian Commission of Military History. And since he is so much into international military history, it cannot surprise us that apart from teaching at the universities of Innsbruck, Graz, and Vienna, he also was a guest professor at the University of Pretoria for a while. So he's been around the block. He's here with us now. Not least, he is among the famous that were born in the year 1956, which marks him out particularly. And he is going to speak today about the independence struggle seen from the outside, so the Austrian view of Slovenia's 10 Days War in 1991. Erwin, you're on the floor already.
Thank you very much, Winfried, for this kind introduction. It's a pleasure being here, being the last one separating you from lunch. When I thought about a paper to present here in Athens, I was faced with a bit of a dilemma, of course. Austrian history is one where independence movements were the ones we rather sought to put down than support. So independence wars from an Austrian perspective is not exactly our kind of thing. However, I thought it might be interesting to go to the case of Slovenia, not least because we are celebrating this year the 30th anniversary. We did a short brochure on this. I brought a few copies. I think there are still some left over there. It's only in German. I apologize, but I thought it might be interesting. And to talk about the 10 Days War in Slovenia and an Austrian perspective on this. This picture shows an Austrian officer. All Austrian troops deployed to the border were clearly marked with red, white, red armbands, looking over the bridge of Radkersburg to the southern side, the Yugoslav, Slovenian side, where you see faintly on the left-hand side of the image, you have Yugoslav tanks encircled and attacked by Slovenian territorial forces. I hope this works. Yes. When we talk about Yugoslavia, it's actually one of three what I would call composite states established at the end of the First World War. The other two were Czechoslovakia, which split peacefully in 1993. We've heard about the Czechs and Slovaks yesterday and before that. And the third one is Ukraine, and we still don't know what will become out of Ukraine. But Yugoslavia, of course, dissolved not peacefully in the 1990s, and of course, Slovenia was the starting point to some extent. There are different historical backgrounds for the different regions. The tensions existing between population groups were aggravated in the Second World War. Yugoslavia was reformed as a communist federal republic in 1945. The Constitution of 1974 established 6 republics and 2 autonomous entities. All of this held together by the dictatorship of Josip Broz Tito, who eventually died in 1980. His position was replaced by a presidency with revolving positions given to the different republics. Whereas the 1970s, in retrospect, are seen as a golden age by Yugoslavs, the 1980s were a time of economic breakdown. And basically, Yugoslavia had experiences similar to many other Eastern Bloc countries during the Cold War period and after this. When we look at the different regions, just to remind you, we have Serbia and Montenegro, which were autonomous principalities in the Ottoman Empire from the late 18th, early 19th century onwards, receiving independence in 1878. Serbia eventually acquired further regions in the south, including Kosovo and what is now Northern Macedonia, and at the end of the First World War acquired also Vojvodina, which had been part of Hungary. Bosnia-Herzegovina was, of course, part of the Ottoman Empire until 1878, when it was administered by Austria-Hungary and was annexed by Austria-Hungary in 1908. The northern parts of Croatia were part of Hungary. The southern parts and parts of the Dalmatian coast, as we have heard a few times, originally were part of the Venetian possessions, passing to Austria in the Napoleonic Wars. Slovenia also was made up of 2 entities. This was the Dukedom of Carniola, Krain in German, whereas the northeastern part, was part of Styria. And to this day, within Slovenia, there are 2 different identities, by the way. When we go from Yugoslavia to Slovenia, we have, with the end of the Cold War, the breakdown of the communist governments. We have a transformation of the communist parties also in Yugoslavia on a republic level, and the League of Communists of Yugoslavia on the federal level dissolved in early 1990s. There were more nationalist parties established in 1990 in the different republics. Democratic elections took place in 1990, and the more nationalist governments came to power in Croatia and Slovenia. Slovenia already held a referendum on independence in December 1990 with an overwhelming result for independence, although it might not be clear whether all people voting or taking part in this referendum had full independence in mind, or rather an enhanced autonomous status. In Croatia, a similar referendum took place in May 1991. Especially in Slovenia, preparations were made for the coming conflict, making use of the so-called territorial organization. These territorial organizations existed in all republics. They were created in the wake of the Czechoslovak crisis of 1968, when Yugoslavia feared a possible intervention by the Warsaw Pact. And to prepare for guerrilla warfare against an occupying power, these territorial organizations were established on a republic basis in addition to the federal Yugoslav forces. And on the 25th of June 1991, both Slovenia and Croatia declared their independence. We may note that already earlier, before these declarations of independence in March 1991, some serious developments took place. There were armed confrontations between Croatian security forces and Serb paramilitary groups in Croatia. There were protests in Belgrade. There was a meeting between the Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic and the Croatian President Franjo Tuđman, by the way, a historian, to some extent a colleague of ours, maybe not the nicest one. And supposedly they already discussed the possibility of splitting Yugoslavia between Croatia and Serbia. This is something very much discussed by Yugoslav historians. What really took place at this meeting? There's no protocol, there are no records of it. And the military leadership already in the spring of 1991 had plans to declare a state of emergency for the whole of Yugoslavia, given these increasing tensions. And Milosevic himself, first the head of the Serb Communist Party and then the president of the Republic of Serbia, publicly declared that he no longer recognized the authority of the federal Yugoslav government. As I said, the new republic was declared on the 25th of June 1991, and one of the first acts was to take over the border posts, which of course was symbolic as well as important for economic reasons, because at the border posts you collect customs duties. And there was also the aim to take control of the airport of Ljubljana, the capital of Slovenia, Laibach in German. And here you see a member of the territorial organization standing next to the new sign Republika Slovenia, which was put up on the 25th, 26th of June 1991. On 27th June, Yugoslav troops were ordered to reoccupy the border posts. And the planned maneuver was to do this by a show of force, not to do it by military means, but the idea was that a show of force would be sufficient to achieve this. According to procedures, the Slovenian leadership was officially informed of military units moving to the border. But on the same day, 2 Yugoslav helicopters were already shot down by Slovenian forces. It is said that one of them was piloted by a Slovenian pilot who was about to defect anyway to the Slovenian side. So these things happen. And one of the main means to stop military forces from reaching the borders was to use trucks as barriers, and there was a preference to use foreign trucks and to have the drivers sitting in the trucks, because if attacked, that might create a tension. We see here a map of Slovenia. By the way, Yugoslavia at the time had 23 million inhabitants and Slovenia something like 2 million, just as a rough indication. And you see here the capital of Ljubljana, Laibach, and units moving out from different garrisons to border posts, and reinforcements making their way from Zagreb Karlovac in Croatia, and also here from Varatin, to move into Slovenia. On the 28th June, Slovenian forces were ordered to attack the Yugoslav troops, and the Yugoslav forces responded with air operations against the Slovenian forces at the border and close to the border, and against these truck barricades I had mentioned. On the 29th June, there was the first attempt by the European communities to arrange a ceasefire. Let's keep in mind this was a time just after the Gulf War of 1991. The European communities were aiming to establish a European unity with a common foreign and security policy. I'm not sure was it the Dutch or the Luxembourg Minister of Foreign Affairs saying this is the hour of Europe. Now that the Americans have settled the Middle East, the Europeans will take care of European affairs. And So the European communities from a very early moment on were involved in what went on, and the air operations continued against Slovenian forces. Just to give you a few images, we have a border station in southern Carinthia here, Grablach-Holmec, which went up in flames, dramatic pictures on the TV screens, just to show you where we are. Here, just in this part of the border. That's near Radkersburg, the place I had also already shown in the first slide, where Yugoslav tanks were encircled near the border post. Their trucks carrying supplies were burned. They were attacked by Slovenians, and they were resupplied from the air by a lone Mi-8 helicopter, a HIP, flying in supplies. And you might notice, by the way, the interesting combination of the rocket pods and the Red Cross sign. Yeah, we're talking about interesting forms of warfare here. This is the corner Radkersburg, or near Radkona, where this took place. Of course, this not only affected the Austrian border. We have here a picture. Oops, sorry. We have here a picture from the Italian border near Nova Gorica, Görz, on the Italian border, and you see Yugoslav tanks being attacked by the Slovenes at the border. This should be here the position of this picture. I think I jumped over this one a little bit earlier, but we've seen this already. On the 1st of July, the Yugoslav National Army declared that its first operations had failed. The show of force had not been sufficient to achieve the aims, and they proposed an escalation, the declaration of a state of emergency, and the use of military force to suppress the rebellion in Slovenia, but this was denied by the Yugoslav presidency. On the 3rd of July, eventually a ceasefire was arranged. It was arranged that the border posts would be taken over by Slovene authorities and that Yugoslav troops would return to their barracks. On the 7th of July, this was followed by the so-called Prioni Agreement. Prioni is an island next to Pula, off the coast of Croatia. It was brokered by the European communities. Slovenia and Croatia suspended their independence for 3 months. The withdrawal of Yugoslav forces from Slovene territory was agreed on, and this was to be supervised by the European Community's monitoring mission, the ECMM, which was a civilian diplomatic observer mission, whose activities eventually were enlarged to cover the whole of this region. To sum up, the Yugoslav forces suffered 44 dead and 146 wounded. The Slovenian forces, 18 killed and 182 wounded, and by the way, 12 foreigners were killed as well. There are some debates about the exact number, of course, like there always is. Let us now come, 5 minutes should work, to the Austrian reaction. Just the background of this, the Austrian government of the day was headed by the Social Democrats. They were in power from 1970 to 2000. At the time of 1991, the Christian Social, Christian Democratic, so-called People's Party was the junior member in government. To some extent, it was a bit of an opposition within the government that sometimes happen in coalition governments. And it is interesting because the Social Democrats always had positive relations with the socialist countries, including Yugoslavia, whereas the Christian Democrats had relation with the opposition movements and the new forces in the communist bloc, and this was also important here. 4 Austrian provincial governors were present during the declarations of independence of Slovenia and Croatia. Military intelligence confirmed that there were no danger of a Yugoslav intervention in Austria, of course. And the federal government initially thought that no military forces would be deployed to the border. Why? Because it would present a pretext for the Yugoslav authorities to reinforce their troops in Slovenia. There was pressure on the local level, however. You had Yugoslav aircraft crossing into Austrian airspace, you had grenades and bullets hitting Austrian territory, and the local population said, I mean, if you don't send the army, we'll defend ourselves. I mean, these are rural regions, many people are hunters, have their rifles, so we'll take the rifle in the hand and defend our country. And so eventually, by pressure from below, actually, the government was forced to deploy military units on the Yugoslav border. Eventually, there were up to 7,700 soldiers deployed in the border areas, but it was not a mobilization. This is something which was hotly discussed at the moment, because some barely trained recruits with 3 months basic training behind them were deployed to the border. And of course, what if something would have happened? Thank God it went well. And one of the commanding officers said our most important weapon was luck. It had eventually positive effects for the armed forces standing, because that was the time of the end of the Cold War. Who needs military forces anymore? That's just a waste of money. But it had negative effects on the reserve organization, because this reserve organization had trained for just these kind of cases, and then they were not called up when it really happened. And by the way, the Army High Command was dissolved in the middle of this crisis, but this had no military but just party political reasons. Just to illustrate this, we have an Austrian M60 tank close to the border. We have Austrian Saab Draken jets at Graz-Thalerhof Airport, and we have here a visit of foreign military attachés in the Radkersburg area. Also quite important, because the Yugoslav authorities claimed that there was a secret plan by NATO and Austria to invade Yugoslavia, which was run under the title of BEDEM. And so the Austrians took care to show to the military attachés that there was no danger of Austria invading Slovenia, but we were just taking precautionary measures at the border. Just a short overview what happened afterwards. I mentioned the 3-year suspension of the independence declaration. In October 1991, Slovenia and Croatia reaffirmed independence. Other Yugoslav republics also declared their independence. Macedonia in November 91. There were quite tensions within the European community, as some of you might remember, that especially Great Britain and France did not want to recognize Slovenia and Croatia. Germany eventually was very much for this. There were new clashes in February 1992. UNPROFOR troops were sent to Croatia to protect the Serb areas there. Bosnia-Herzegovina declared their independence in March 1992, and by May 1992, Slovenia and Croatia joined the UN. And with this, I'll end this presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Erwin. Now we have roughly 25 minutes for discussion. Make the most of it and start questioning our panelists now. Yes, the first question is here in the forefront. I see our Moroccan colleague and Markovis. So, would you please start?
Jose Romero from the Spanish Delegation Commission. And thank you, the three speakers. They were amazing presentations and so different. My question goes there to our Smith, our Austrian colleague, and it is it regards to the level of surprise. You know, we in the last recent events in Afghanistan and Crimea, to say a couple of examples, I mean, the Westerners, we have been always surprised by events, how fast and how quick they went. So I would like to know your opinion, because you are a neighbor country, so how much the Austrian government or population media was surprised by events in the breakout of Yugoslavia? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a good question. By and large, everybody expected something to happen in Yugoslavia for several decades. That was very clear. I mean, everybody was more or less certain that as long as Tito lived, it might work. But after his death, it was most likely to erupt in problems. This does not mean that it was a foregone conclusion that Yugoslavia would dissolve. Eventually it took that way. What was a bit of surprise that it happened so quickly. And there were different, I would say, different levels of surprise. And who was probably most surprised were the Yugoslav army units, who found themselves suddenly attacked by their own compatriots. And within the Yugoslav army units, you had a lot of Slovenian soldiers. So it was definitely a surprise for the Yugoslav army that they were suddenly attacked by their own people.
Le prochain sera le professeur El Alaoui du Maroc.
Oui, donc professeur Babana El Alaoui, docteur Babana El Alaoui de la délégation marocaine du Maroc. Bien, alors c'est très intéressant, c'est ce que nous venons d'entendre de la part de nos prestigieux intervenants. J'ai deux petites questions à poser. La première s'adresse à mon collègue Ebode du Cameroun. Et la seconde s'adresse à M. Schmidl de l'Autriche. Concernant la première question, concernant la guerre d'indépendance du Cameroun, bien sûr, il y a comme suite à la thématique d'hier, sur les guerres d'indépendance et de séparatisme. Je voudrais savoir jusqu'à quel point les autorités du pouvoir central ont pu et arrivent jusqu'à aujourd'hui à affronter le mouvement séparatiste anglophone du Cameroun. Et puis, quelles sont les motivations exactes du séparatisme? Parce que généralement, quand on voit les mouvements de séparatisme dans le monde, vous voyez toujours que la province ou la structure, parti politique ou autre, qui souhaite le séparatisme, c'est toujours dans une région qui est riche. Jamais les régions pauvres ne demandent le séparatisme. Donc, il y a des raisons géopolitiques et économiques, si vous voudrez nous en éclairer. Merci. Pour la deuxième question, qui concerne notre ami Schmidl, je me suis trop intéressé à la problématique yougoslave, en ce qui concerne le démembrement de la Yougoslavie, à tel point qu'un certain nombre de théoriciens parlaient de la Yougoslavie est partie de la Yougoslavie VIE, la vie, c'est-à-dire l'unité, à la yougoslave mort, did, vous voyez, par le séparatisme. Et je sais que, bien sûr, votre pays a dû souffrir des répercussions de la guerre d'indépendance, n'est-ce pas, de certains nombres de pays qui étaient membres de la Yougoslavie, qui faisaient l'unité yougoslave. Alors, ma question est précise, la voici. Est-ce que d'abord, pourquoi il y a certains pays européens qui étaient pour l'indépendance et l'éclatement de la Yougoslavie? L'Allemagne a reconnu, comme vous le savez, n'est-ce pas, en ce qui concerne surtout la Slovénie et la Croatie, mais, par exemple, l'Angleterre était réticente. Pourquoi? Donc, il y a certainement des raisons. En ce qui concerne, enfin, la décision concernant autoproclamation, parce qu'il y a autoproclamation et il y a proclamation. Par exemple, en Rhodésie, lors de la période de Ian Smith, comme vous le savez, quand il y a eu autoproclamation, n'est-ce pas, de la Rhodésie, eh bien, l'Angleterre était contre. Et entre la période de l'autoproclamation et la proclamation, la reconnaissance par l'ONU même il y a quand même une période qui se passe. Alors, quelle est, bref, la réaction et si vous voulez, l'endurance de l'Autriche en ce qui concerne l'opposition armée de la Yougoslavie, du pouvoir central, par rapport aux autres pays? Et merci beaucoup.
Merci, vous avez posé deux principales questions. Jusqu'à quel point les autorités de Yaoundé maîtrisent-elles la dynamique séparatiste dans la zone anglophone du Cameroun et quelles sont les raisons du séparatisme actuel? Je vais commencer par la deuxième question parce qu'il y a un lien avec la première. Alors, du point de vue de l'analyse, et comme vous le savez, dans ce genre de situation, personne ne donne ses raisons de manière objective et de manière entière. Donc on se limite aux analyses qu'on peut faire du point de vue de la science. Alors les raisons du séparatisme ou de la volonté de certains de se séparer sont nombreuses. Première raison, ça peut être d'ordre culturel. Bien évidemment, vous voyez que cette partie du Cameroun qui fut historiquement donc à la charge de la Grande-Bretagne a eu une expérience de gestion des affaires publiques qui n'a pas été la même que celle qu'on a connue dans la partie francophone. Ce n'est d'ailleurs pas un hasard si tout à l'heure j'ai dit que certains fuyaient la zone, certains combattants, puisque la guerre se passe dans la partie francophone, fuyaient pour aller dans la zone anglophone. Et la France a dû intervenir auprès de la Grande-Bretagne pour qu'on les renvoie dans la zone francophone. Donc, il y a des raisons de management historique. L'autre raison d'ordre culturel, c'est tout simplement la question des traditions ancestrales, l'indirect rôle, et puis la colonisation directe. Chacun a grandi avec ça. Et enfin, toujours du point de vue de la culture, c'est quand même deux langues différentes. Ce n'est jamais confortable lorsque vous êtes une minorité. Sinon, les Québécois ne se plairaient pas. Ce n'est jamais confortable d'être une minorité. Donc la conscience subjective d'être minoritaire dans un espace vous met toujours en tension. Alors des raisons politiques, il y en a aussi. Lorsqu'on passe au libéralisme politique et que vous n'avez pas espoir qu'un jour vous pouvez gagner l'élection au one man, one vote, ça crée aussi des frustrations. Et ça arrive dans une situation où aujourd'hui on fait la décentralisation ou on fait le fédéralisme. Parce que quelqu'un veut avoir espoir qu'un jour il peut gouverner au niveau du sommet. Mais se basant sur le fait qu'il est minoritaire, il est mal à l'aise. C'est pour cela qu'on leur a donné un régime spécial. Mais le régime spécial ne donne pas une assurance si le vote est purement linguistique, que vous aurez accès au sommet. Maintenant, il y a des raisons économiques. C'est vrai qu'historiquement, la partie francophone a souvent été plus riche que la partie anglophone. Mais dans les années 70, la découverte du pétrole a fait naître une conscience subjective que c'était la partie anglophone qui était devenue plus riche. Et le rapprochement avec le Nigeria, qui est beaucoup plus riche aussi en pétrole, même économiquement, crée aussi des frustrations et offre des modèles de gouvernance différents. Le paradoxe seulement avec le Nigeria, c'est qu'après qu'on ait combattu l'État central, on a adopté le fédéralisme. Aujourd'hui, on combat le fédéralisme. Donc, ça donne des contre-exemples au point où on ne sait plus exactement quel est le meilleur modèle. Et enfin, il y a des raisons géostratégiques. Tout le monde sait que beaucoup de ceux qui combattent ont des soutiens à l'extérieur, reçoivent des fonds de l'extérieur, en Occident. Donc, ça ramène à peu près à ce que vous avez dit sur la richesse comme facteur principal du séparatisme. J'en viens donc à la première question. Vous comprenez que des causes ou des explications que je viens d'indiquer, on peut donc savoir comment le pouvoir central ajuste ou se réajuste. Il y a un aspect sur la gouvernance, comment gérer deux écosystèmes linguistiques qui ont eu des passés coloniaux différents. La première modalité a voulu que le Cameroun soit le seul pays où on n'a jamais fêté le jour de l'indépendance. En reprenant les réclamations de l'UPC qui ont été évoquées tout à l'heure, et hier, la réunification des deux parties, la date qui a été retenue comme fête officielle au Cameroun, c'est cette date-là, la réunification des deux parties. C'était une modalité pour dire que ces pays existaient bien avant la colonisation. Même l'idée d'écrire généralement Cameroun plutôt avec K, c'était une modalité pour dire que à cette époque-là, la division n'était pas linguistique. Maintenant, les offres politiques ont été engagées. C'est donc, à la différence de ceux qui voulaient ou qui veulent le sécessionnisme, Il y a donc la question du choix entre le fédéralisme qu'on avait déjà été et la décentralisation. On a adopté la décentralisation, mais en donnant aussi un statut spécial à cette région. À la date d'aujourd'hui, l'État central tient, mais il est difficile de résoudre le problème du point de vue politique parce que les raisons que j'ai indiquées tout à l'heure, les secours extérieurs, les agendas cachés, ce n'est donc pas très facile. Merci beaucoup.
Oui, mon cher professeur, merci de toutes les deux questions, en effet, parce que aussi la première question est de relevance pour la Yougoslavie, parce que la Slovénie et la Croatie étaient les républiques les plus riches dans de la Yougoslavie. Concernant l'autre question, tout le monde a parlé de la Yougoslavie, mais tout le monde a pensé à l'Union soviétique. Et le craint était que la dissolution de la Yougoslavie pourrait être un modèle pour la dissolution éventuelle de l'Union soviétique. Nous sommes en juillet 91, ça veut dire 2 mois à peu près avant le coup d'État à Moscou et un demi-an avant la dissolution de l'Union soviétique. Alors, une des questions était toujours d'éviter que la Yougoslavie pourrait être un modèle négatif pour l'Union soviétique. On a dit que les politiciens autrichiens ont eu un certain rôle à convaincre le chancelier allemand Helmut Kohl de soutenir l'indépendance de la Slovénie et la Croatie. Et en effet, c'était la pressure allemande en décembre 91 de pratiquement forcer la communauté européenne de reconnaître l'indépendance.
The last question I see is Marco Wies here, so go ahead.
Yes, might need a microphone from back here. It's Marco Weiss, Britain and Lancaster University. I have a question to start with for Erwin, and then I would have a question for Professor Ntunde Bode from Cameroon. Winfried, you mentioned that it improved the standing of the Austrian armed forces, the deployment. I was wondering what effect it had, if it had any, or impact on the transformation of the Austrian armed forces and Austrian security and defense policy. So, short, straightforward question, because you could see this kind of move towards more domestic tasks, but it has also sort of a peacekeeping element in it somehow. For a colleague from Cameroon, je me suis posé la question quand on regarde le Cameroun qui était divisé pendant un certain temps pour être géré par la Grande-Bretagne et la France, et quand on regarde la période de l'après-guerre, il y avait quand même l'idée que la France et la Grande-Bretagne essayent de coopérer en Afrique. Bon, il y avait des tentatives durant la fin des années 40, le début des années 50, que la France et la Grande-Bretagne se sont rencontrés régulièrement pour discuter de leur politique en Afrique, développement et plus tard aussi décolonisation. Mais malgré ça, ce qu'on voit après, c'est une politique française très agressive pour protéger son précaré, comme on dit, sa sphère d'influence en Afrique, et c'est des effets politiques. Les effets politiques, on les voit jusqu'à nos jours. Et alors, je me suis posé la question, est-ce qu'on pourrait peut-être considérer le Cameroun une exception en quelque sorte de coopération franco-britannique durant le processus de décolonisation ou non? Je serais très intéressé d'avoir votre point de vue par rapport à cela. Merci.
Thank you very much, Marco. Actually, the Austrian armed forces at this time were in a period of transformation. They were scaled down already in the late 1980s. They were deployed at the eastern border from the late summer 1990 onwards, because, you know, everybody celebrated the fall of the Iron Curtain, but then suddenly the question arose, who takes care of the borders? What a direct effect was that the armed forces were able to receive new and more modern equipment. For example, until that time, there were no missiles in the armed forces, which was based on an interpretation of the State Treaty of 1955. And when you look at the image of the Draken jets, they were not armed with missiles, but only with cannon. So there were also some legal improvements, so it definitely had an effect. And we might also say that at the same time, you had these 7,000 people deployed on the Slovenian border. We had something like 2,000 people on the eastern border, plus about 1,000 people on international missions abroad, plus something like 300 or 400 person field hospital in Iran taking care of Kurdish refugees after the Gulf War. And of course, what was interesting, I mentioned this point about non-mobilizing reserve forces, that there were certain elements in the armed forces who definitely wanted to transform it from a conscript army into a professional army. And so it was thought that if we make use of the reserve forces at the time, it won't be so easy to get rid of them. So it was a very multifaceted thing.
Merci. Est-ce qu'on peut considérer le Cameroun comme un modèle de coopération parfaite en Afrique? C'est ma manière de comprendre. Puisque c'est comparé à la coopération entre la Grande-Bretagne et la France. C'est ça la question. Du point de vue de l'analyste, je ne peux pas le dire comme ça. Je pense que l'une des règles de la colonisation qui a continué au moment des indépendances, sans que tout cela soit bien écrit, a voulu que la Grande-Bretagne a laissé le Cameroun à la France, comme ailleurs, la France a pris le petit Togo, je crois qu'on appelait ça la compensation, a pris le petit Togo et a laissé le reste du grand territoire à la Grande-Bretagne, je crois que c'est le Soudan. Voilà. Donc, nous, on ne sent pas ça beaucoup sur place. Et ce n'est pas un hasard. Si je prends un seul élément, vous allez constater que dans l'usage de la monnaie, par exemple, c'est la monnaie française que tout le monde utilise. D'ailleurs, lorsque je parlais tout à l'heure de la conscience subjective de la domination, une partie des anglophones refuse l'état jacobin de la centralisation. Ça représente quoi? Ça représente la France. Est-ce que la Grande-Bretagne sur le terrain est là? Oui, sur le plan des affaires. Mais sur le plan politique, on ne la sent pas beaucoup. Donc j'ai l'impression qu'il y a les accords tacites. Chacun s'occupe de son prix de carré. Sauf qu'avec le temps, les carrés deviennent les triangles. Merci.
Thank you for... Ladies and gentlemen, I know I'm standing between you and your well-deserved lunch, but there are three ways in which I need to add my voice to the chorus of thanks. The first thanks go to our panel for 3 very diverse but equally fascinating presentations made well within the time limit and also in a way that made life easier for the translators, and I think we should include the translators in those thanks as well. Second, I was hoping someone would start that. Secondly, my thanks go to you for your patience and for being here at all and for not having succumbed to all the wishes to go home earlier. And the third thanks, of course, should go to the organizers of this Congress. We are the last working session, so maybe now is time to say that again. And here we should name the hotel staff, we should name General Rachmanidis, and of course we should name in particular Efi. Thanks for all you've done. Thanks for making it all so smooth and so lovely. And we had a great time in Athens. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. You can give another show of hands.
As usual, your papers are so well presented, and as usual, you never fail. And I think